when I was crawling across those comics and reading comic books, but before comic books was the Detroit Free Press comic section. And my father would read it, and then he would hand it to me, or I would take it. I would be on my knees, hands and knees, be studying the drawings, and I couldn't read, so I didn't know the punchlines or anything. But I would study those drawings really carefully. I never had anybody to talk to about it. I didn't know that in some ways I was unique in this attention that I was paying to this. And as soon as I could read, I started understanding why my father, when reading it, would chuckle, because it was funny. But it was already funny enough for me. If I had never learned to read, it would have been perfectly fine with me. I think that idea of all that came into me, and I already had a take on things. So I think I already had that funny bone that just needed nurturing.
How often do you thumb through your favorite magazine and think, wish I could paint like that? Mrs. Gertrude Vanderpoel of New York felt that way. Although she had never even held a brush before, she decided to do something in art. Then there's John Whitaker of Memphis, Tennessee. He was a reservations clerk for an airline. Then he found a way to get the art training he needed to become a cartoonist. In 2 years, he was drawing a daily syndicated newspaper comic strip. One after another have come these inspiring success stories. To discover men and women with talent worth developing, the famous artists have created this special 12-page art talent test. People who reveal talent through this test are eligible for professional training by the school right in their own homes.
The Famous Artist School was founded in 1948 in Westport, Connecticut by Al Dorn, who was a very famous editorial illustrator at the time. He and others wanted to cement the wisdom and methods that they had used in their illustration careers to pass down to future generations. So Dorn called upon 11 other famous illustrators, including Norman Rockwell, who of course was extremely well known, to put together their own personal ideas and wisdom about what a student would have to do to become a competent illustrator. At the time, magazines, newspapers, and advertisers were using illustration and cartooning on a constant basis. With that in mind, the Famous Artist Illustration course took off and became extremely popular as a correspondence course.
So the Famous Artist Cartoon course was created in 1956, I think in response to the success of the Famous Artist School and the feeling that there would be interest among potential students in learning cartooning. Not only for print, for magazines and newspapers and so forth, but also for television and advertising. Many of the cartoonists who were tapped to create that course actually have stayed more household names than some of the artists who were then famous. The cartoonists, I think a lot of people would say that they've heard of Rube Goldberg and Milton Caniff and Capp. I have to say that I have a very soft spot for Whitney Darrow Jr. His eye for capturing the essence of a wide variety of characters, but particularly children. He was really a genius at drawing children. I think actually several of the cartoonists had a gentle kind of humor, really based on not knee slapping or laugh out loud funny, but just the gentle observation of how people, things that people do that are amusing. Barney Tobey also had I think, a gentle approach to what was funny.
Barney Tobey was a great gag cartoonist, and gag cartoons are essentially single panel drawings that have a tagline that is intended to make people laugh. And what he said was that it's really difficult to create spontaneous looking drawings because oftentimes the drawings have to be repeated over and over and over again until each element is just right. So he emphasized the idea of really consciously trying to make your drawings look spontaneous, even though they're very practiced. The cartoonist Al Capp was very famous for his cartoon strip called Lil Abner. Al Capp's chapter really focused on the idea of the figure in motion. And what he talked about was the idea that you have to imagine a figure not in one flat position, but you have to think about how that character would actually move through space and be able to picture the character from pretty much any point of view.
Well, Al Capp was sort of, he's someone I almost couldn't relate to because the drawings were so accomplished, and not something I even considered trying to draw like him. Rube Goldberg I felt a real connection with, and I loved his whole thing, those complicated machines for doing simple tasks. He was someone also that really, his style, drawing style, was really like many of the cartoonists of the time. It was nothing totally distinctive about the style of the drawing.
The cartoonist Rube Goldberg did a very wide variety of work, but also became known for doing what were called types in cartooning. Notice how the requirements of each job have affected their clothes and personality. As a cartoonist, you must study and know what makes a type, because types are your business.
I remember Willard Mullin, one of my favorites. I was not into sports, have never been. It was of no interest to me in particular. But his drawings, his sports drawing, when someone's flying out to catch something like that, the way that body moves and stuff, there's none better. I mean, that is fabulous stuff.
Though he grew up in Los Angeles, Willard Mullin actually created an extremely famous logo, the Brooklyn Bum for the Brooklyn Dodgers. What he said was, keep it loose. When you start a pencil, let that pencil swing in the mass and feel of the figures. And the fluidity of his line created a very believable and fluid figure. Milton Caniff, who drew the action-adventure series Steve Canyon, which appeared in hundreds of newspapers for over 40 years, basically said that a cartoonist with a realistic style must keep his actions close to what the real figure is capable of doing. And that is something that came up over and over again for Caniff, but also for others. Interestingly, Norman Rockwell's nephew, Richard Rockwell, was hired by Milton Caniff to draw Steve Canyon. And even after Caniff died, Richard Rockwell continued to draw and ink the strip as well. The Famous Artist Cartoon course had 24 chapters, and they ranged in topic from very basic things like how to draw the human head, how to create expressions, to how to create the figure in motion, and even how to create cartoon lettering. The chapters were essentially fairly short, but they were filled with very informative text and very detailed drawings. And at the end of each chapter, there was a yellow sheet of paper that outlined an assignment that each student was asked to fulfill. When the student was done, that drawing that they had created had to be sent to Westport, Connecticut, which was the headquarters of the Famous Artist School, and there, probably about 100 illustrators, cartoonists, and art directors were ready to accept that work. Basically, a tissue overlay or tracing paper overlay would be placed on top of the student's work. An instructor would actually redraw the things maybe that the student had been struggling with on the tissue with commentary. And then a letter would be dictated to one of the secretaries there, explaining exactly what the student had done well, but also what the student could do to improve.
And they would show you how to make it better, how to infuse it with movement and action and stuff.
I was familiar with the Famous Artist School as a kid. On the back of comic books, you saw that drawing of Norman Rockwell we're looking for people that like to draw. So I took their art talent test when I was in about the 8th grade. When the representative came to our home, he said, well, you show promise, and we'd like you to enroll. And I took the adult course as an 8th grader through the 10th grade. I finished. I tell you, I look back over those. I still have the workbooks today. I have no idea what talent they saw in me. If I were an instructor looking at all of that, I'd say, don't give up the day job, kid.
I was aware of the famous cartoonist school, as well as the famous artist school. I guess that's all together. But I couldn't afford to get it. I was very young, but a friend of mine, he was able to put together the money, and I don't know where he got it from, but he was able to get that lesson, the famous artist school and the famous cartoonist school. He was able to get all that, and I was so jealous, but I used it more than he did. Whenever I went to his house, it was always on the shelf. So I would take it down and really study and try to get whatever I could out of those books. So when I saw the cartoon course, I actually was copying, like I said, I was copying, even tracing. But I did notice that everything was based kind of like a balloon shape for the heads. And that's something, at first I thought that was great, but then I started to see beyond that. So you know what? The skull is more like a circle on top, and then there's the jaw on the bottom. So I started using a circle as a base, and then if I needed somebody with a big jaw, well, the cranium is probably not going to change that much, but the jaw is going to change that much. So I just started to riff off of what I saw them doing. They launched me, they started me. But still, it was just such a great way to learn from, to me, were the great masters, because those fundamentals were there, but in a way that I could relate to them as a cartoonist.
I was certainly familiar with, most if not all of the artists, that were faculty for the famous cartoonists. I wouldn't say any of them were necessarily like, oh, this is my guy, but absolutely they're like in the galaxy of cartoonists that I admire and respect, for sure. I think it's very solid drawing advice, for sure. I think the lessons hold up in terms of this is how you achieve these results. Obviously some of it is a little dated, this is how you draw a lady that needs to go on a diet, there's some things in there that definitely freeze it in a time and place, but in terms of the structural how to draw, it's pretty good.
As a child, I didn't understand how they got to be so perfect. Obviously they're sketching and, figuring it out. I figured it out, but that was some sort of whimsical reaction to it. And so when you brought it to me, that was my first reaction. Was I was excited. I love seeing this kind of stuff. I hadn't seen this book. And so it's really inspiring, and it brought back a lot of good memories. A lot of what they talk about in the book is the assignment and the materials that you need. And you need an 11 by 14 Bristol board, measure off an ink, 9 inches wide, and all these instructions, that kind of thing. With the advent of digital art, and the one thing that I did, especially on the Boxer here, you can see me scale stuff. You can see me move it around and perfect it. And that is the one thing that digital art has kind of allowed, is I don't have to have a Bristol board. I love drawing on paper still, but the advent of the digital tools, and I still feel like this looks like I'm drawing with a pencil. I still feel that it looks like I'm drawing with a pen. I don't think anything is lost in this new digital version of it that I recreated.
It's very dated in all kinds of ways. And when you sent me one of the classes, and I tried really following the class, and of course the drawings I did look like they came out of the 50s. Stereotypes are totally useful when you're doing illustration, because it signals right away the character and who's, if you're talking about a boss and a worker, you draw the boss in a stereotypical way, and even though that might not correspond to reality anymore. So there's that. but there's also the stereotypes that are a little pernicious, and you couldn't do that today. There's a whole course, one of the classes is how to draw pretty women, and it's kind of funny to look at them. And it was useful to me because I always had trouble drawing pretty women. It's much easier for me to draw someone who's, not pretty odd looking or whatever. And I always had trouble drawing someone who was supposed to be attractive. So this was actually kind of useful for me.
So in general, in cartooning, they use caricature, but sometimes caricature can be based on stereotypes. And that can be a little bit touchy if you're not careful, because this is a different world. And back then, there was a little more leniency as far as, how you would depict certain people, maybe you'd say rotund or things like that. Different words that you use, but right now you'd have to be more careful about the kind of words you use and how you even portray people.
I think in terms of the style that's being taught in the famous books, which does rely a lot on like caricature and exaggeration, I think there's definitely still a space for caricature and exaggeration in cartooning and in humor drawing. I think learning to do caricature also makes you a better observer. So even whether or not this is a style you care to like explore, I think it's useful to look at just in terms of like, how is this going to help me to see?
I'm going through the course myself, looking at the detail. I mean, it's a course that people could, with some exceptions for understanding that it's from another era in our lives, learn a lot from it.
There's nothing in here that is out of date other than the way it's written. To read something from a different time and a way of teaching is very different. You buy like a how to draw book now and it's very like step 1, step 2, step 3, and less of like a philosophy on it, or less of talking about why we're doing what we're doing. And I think that's what these books do a lot better.
I don't remember how much I learned from that course specifically, but I think I learned quite a bit. And as I've said, I learned more from that course, from those 12 lessons, than anything from the Chicago Academy of Fine Art.
Yeah, I think it would have maybe sent me in a different direction. I think I was impressed with the teaching, with the structure of the classes and what they had you do, and it was, again, not necessarily just for cartooning, but for drawing in general.